my pleasure to introduce Esther Keymolen. Is Associate Professor of Philosophy of Data-Driven Technology at the University of Tilburg. In particular, the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society. Next to that, she's also doing having an admin role as Vice Dean of Research at the Tilburg Law School. Her background is in philosophy of technology and post-phenomenology. This is also where we met at SPT conferences, Esther, right? And yeah, her research focused on the role of trust and privacy in network and smart environments. In her book, Trust on the Line, she develops a conceptual trust model, which she then applies to various cases. In her research, she always combines the conceptual and normative analysis with empirical approaches. And currently, she's working on an NWO project on blockchain. I don't know if that's still going on now, Esther, but yeah, it's still going on. Okay, so this is one of the many things you're doing, of course. And yeah, we're looking forward to your talk. Welcome here at the Winter School.
Yes, thank you so much for this introduction and for having me. I feel very honored to be part of this Winter School and to open this this morning. So I can quickly already kind of go to the second slide, which is an introduction, which actually Mark already did by heart, so that I don't need to repeat myself. So indeed, just kind of give you a bit more background. So my main interest indeed is in trust and trustworthiness, and I'm going to touch upon it, but only indirectly, because besides all the things that Mark just said, also one of the things that lately really interests me is the role and responsibility of professionals. I will generally talk about tech professionals and what their responsibility is in developing trustworthy technologies, practices, services. So this is going to be a bit more my focus for today, is what is the role of professionals in developing these technologies. And this is also partly because, so I still teach one course because with the Vice Dean role, I'm most of the times in meetings. And so I'm also very happy not to be in this kind of meeting, but in this meeting, which is of course more about the content and not about the processes. But I also teach one course, and that course is to data scientists who also want to become entrepreneurs. So they come into this program with the idea of becoming the next Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but then in the Netherlands. And for them, so they get this ethics course from me, and that's always a tough start, because they oftentimes see ethics as a kind of an obstacle to become an entrepreneur, not something that will enable them to become a better entrepreneur. So this is something that I found interesting to see if I could kind of switch that image. And I found one way of doing that is really focusing on their individual personal responsibility role in developing and these technologies. So this is also what I want to do today, is kind of focus on that. And I will do that by first looking into kind of giving you kind of very quick and dirty overview of AI and data ethics and what the pros and cons are of that domain. And then I want to kind of switch a little bit perspective and focus on, from a virtue ethics approach, to what it means to become a better person in the data-driven context. And I will in particular focus on the work of one specific philosopher, Iris Murdoch. Some of you might also know her as a novelist, as a writer, but she's also very, I believe, to be a very interesting and inspiring philosopher. And she says, well, in order to become a better person, we need to find a just mode of vision and a good quality of consciousness. And these, of course, are big words. And I'm going to try to kind of unravel that a bit in my talk. And in particular, what I want to add to that, and which I think is also important for this, for you, for the audience, for this winter school, is the role of technological mediation in becoming these better professionals, better persons. So then I want to kind of tailor it to the tech professional context. There's a chat, so I think you can also ask questions. So that I try to kind of keep room for questions after the talk, but if you feel the urge to already submit questions, that's perfectly okay. And if I can take them along in my talk, I will try to, and if not, I will definitely answer them. I hope to answer them afterwards. Yeah, so without any other questions, I just start the real talk. So talking about AI and data ethics, I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that this focus on what it means to have ethical data-driven practices is kind of a reaction maybe to a lot of bad press that we've seen over the years. And we had a lot of incidents, tragedies, you could say, about discriminating algorithms, biases, problems with unjust applications. So there is this, on the one hand, that we see the possibilities of these technologies, that what they can bring us to develop or shape a society that is just, that is democratic, that has certain values set in place. So we have to empower citizens, but on the other side, we also see these challenges. And I think if you look at over the last 5 to 7 years, you see that with the arrival of these incidents, you also see kind of the arrival of a kind of growing community of both, as we will see, academics and practitioners that feel the need to develop new insights, new perspectives on how to develop technologies in a way to hopefully stop these incidents, or at least make sure that we have better tools to deal with them. And so this is kind of where data and AI ethics comes in. And I like to think of data ethics that you can kind of see that on 3 different levels. So you see that there is the need to develop technologies with certain values that we think are very important. I think of privacy, think of trustworthiness, think of transparency, so that we have to kind of find ways to develop these technologies in a way that they kind of foster these important fundamental values. A second layer, and I'm going to the big one, the organization level, is there you see there is a tendency to look for ways to structure our organizations, to structure our companies, to make sure that there is room for these technologies to be developed in a certain value sensitive way, and to have a kind of checks and balances. So there you could think of oversight boards, for instance, or ethical committees, or codes of conduct that are being developed in order to kind of make sure there is a kind of culture in a company or an organization to make these or to have enough attention for these ethical questions. And you see that from both academic and business perspective, this is being explored. And in the middle circle, the people circle, is really the question about, so what kind of people, what kind of skills do these professionals, these people who are developing these technologies, what kind of skills do they need to actually have? What kind of virtues, as our techno-moral virtues, need these people to make that happen? And if in my view, so this last circle is a bit less developed. So you see a lot of attention for the organization structure, so how to govern companies, organizations. We see a lot of interest in design principles, technological solutions on how to embed values. But on the people level, so to say, so what kind of people, what kind of professionals do we need? there I think some work still needs to be done. And to give you some idea of this AI principle, so you have a kind of explosion of design principles, both in the academic as well as in the professional domain. And oftentimes, I just picked one, but I could have picked like 10 others. And there you see oftentimes it's the same kind of values, principles being listed. So there is the importance of fairness. We need to make sure that we don't exclude people. Of course, our technologies need to be reliable and safe. We have the GDPR, so we need to take into consideration privacy, data protection. It's important that we don't have black boxes, so we need to have some level of transparency, and we want our companies or organizations to be accountable if something goes wrong in the end. And of course, you can, and these are, I think, these are all very important and relevant principles. So I'm definitely not saying that we should get rid of them. So they're really, really important. So you also have that in ING, so even in not tech companies, and you see that all companies that are becoming more data-driven, organizations becoming more data-driven, they're really thinking about how do we, in a responsible way, deal with all the data that we are using and the services that we are developing. On the governance level, I already mentioned that you see oversight boards, you see ethical councils, you see ethical teams. So there are, in some companies, you have dedicated teams that you can ask your questions to if you have a problem. So you see there are always all kind of strategies to ensure that we develop applications in a responsible, ethical way. And so, as I said, so this is good, right? So it's good that we pay attention to that from both the governance perspective and on these principles level. But there are also challenges, and people are also a bit worried about it for different reasons. First of all, these principles oftentimes remain kind of abstract. So, okay, well, so fairness is really important, but how are you really going to implement it? How are you going to make sure that fairness is part of your design, is part of your application? You also run the risk that with these general lists that are not really tailored to the specific expertise of people, not tailored to the specific culture of people, which I think Mark will be talking about later, it remains kind of yes, it's important, but how does it really help me? So that you run the risk that it become a kind of checklist, right? So we check the boxes and then we are safe, we are clear. With these principles and especially also with this focus on technology, you also run the risk that you focus a lot on the design phase, and then if that has been done properly, you're out of the, you're safe. So you don't need to think further or be critical about what happens next with the technology. And specifically, if you look at all these governance checks and balances, so these ethics boards, these advisory boards, on the one hand, you could say that's good. They give some kind of regulatory force to these ethical principles, but in the end, they're self-regulatory. So I can't go to court, so to say, if a company doesn't adhere to its own policies or to the advice of their ethics board. So you run the risk of kind of ethics washing certain organizations. And again, also with all these different lists and principles, you also run the risk that you kind of choose the ones that you that are easier for you as a company or organization or an individual even to adhere to these principles and leave the tough ones out. So you get a kind of what's referred to as ethics shopping. So I'm maybe kind of it's a kind of quick and dirty overview, and I'm not maybe not properly also highlighting the positive aspects of it. But I think it's important to kind of see that we are not there yet. So it's necessary to have these principles. It's necessary to have these governmental checks and balances, but it's not enough. So I believe we need to complement it at least with this people level. So this focus on the person, on the profession and the professional. And this is actually related, is embedded in a kind of virtue ethics approach. So if you take a kind of if you look at it from a moral theory perspective, virtue ethics is, you could say, kind of anti-theory. So they say, yeah, well, it's important to have principles, it's important to have rules, but in the end of the day, I need to kind of understand how to use them in practice. So I have to understand how they need to be tailored to a certain context. So what you need is a good person who sees what is needed in a certain situation and who is able to kind of translate these big principles to make them work in practice. And in order to do that, you need to develop some virtues, you need to develop certain character traits that enable you to do that. And we can go back to kind of very ancient philosophers. For instance, Aristotle, who says that, well, in order to have these virtues, you need to look at a golden mean. So you have to look between what's in the middle of two vices, and then you kind of are able to develop these virtues. And but in the end, what's really crucial is that you develop practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is the ability to establish what is more morally required, tailored to the situation at hand. Sorry, I'm going too quickly. And in order to do that, it's important that that we do that in a kind of continuous way. So it's not something that you're born with, it's something that you can learn, and it's something that you can learn by doing it continuously. So it's not something that it's just about the intellectual aspect of it. It's not just about knowing the definition of the concept, but it's really about practicing it. So taking these key ideas with us, the question becomes, so what should we do as tech professionals to become these better persons, to become virtuous in a way that we are able to take these design principles and make them of use in our professional context. And so thinking about that, so what would we need to become virtuous persons? I want to turn now to the work of Iris Murdoch. And she, to be honest, she doesn't have a very positive image of human beings, in the sense that she said, like, one of the core problems that we face, you could say, is that we have, and I'm quoting, fat, relentless egos. And with that, she means that the way in which we approach the world around us, the way in which we approach life, is oftentimes based on our personal needs. So the way in which we perceive the world around us is oftentimes tailored to our self-interest. And this kind of keeps us from seeing what is really needed from an ethical point of view. And so you could say that she actually said, like, yeah, that the way in which we experience the world around us and our relationships is actually mediated by this fat, relentless ego. So we have to kind of work on what she then refers to as unselfing, so kind of getting rid or overcoming this fat, relentless ego. And we need that in order to have this just mode of looking and having a good quality of consciousness. So what she says actually is, if we really want to develop technologies that address the ethical needs of people, we have to make sure that we don't get in the way of ourselves, that our own needs and own perspectives are not too much tailoring the actions and solutions that we see. So she she thinks it's really important that in order to see another person, that we need to kind of adapt our own perspective and adopt their perspective, and become way much clearer on the context that another person is living in. So it's actually really a challenging question or for us, right? Because it is really part of us, that the way we see our environment, the way we see people, the way we see technology is so much based on what we think is important to us and our own context. Luckily, she also comes with kind of some strategies, you could say, to kind of engage in unselfing. And it's something that's really typical to the virtue ethics perspective. It's really something that can be learned. And so she said, like, well, ways to get kind of to get away of our fat ego is by looking for beauty, for instance, through art or nature, and through imagination. And I want to start there. So in order to kind of find a proper, genuine moral attention to the problems that we need to adhere to, we can make use of our imagination. And you might think, well, that's kind of strange, right? If you're arguing for a good, proper way of looking and to really see what is at stake, then we're going to use imagination, or aren't we then just getting away from what's really in front of us? And the best way, and she will say no, because she will say that actually through imagination we can perceive the world as it is. For her, imagination is not about getting away from reality, but actually joining it through imagination. And I think the best way to kind of understand what that means, this moral imagination, is to contrast it with fantasy. So fantasy is really about kind of is kind of imagining that is distorted by self-concern. So when you are kind of in a fantasy world, you are kind of fantasizing, or you kind of come up with a fantasy where your perception is really about your self-concern. So you think that you perceive what a person really needs, but actually you're looking for, you're kind of seeing what you could do, and this is how you're going to kind of see or kind of identify what other persons need. So it's not really what other persons need, but you as a person are able to provide. Or if you're kind of trying to identify a certain problem, you're seeing problems that you also feel as being an important problem. So you see, you're looking at you're kind of building a fantasy based on what is your own self concern. But with imagination, you're doing something different. So with imagination, you're really trying to perceive the world as it is by trying to put yourself in the position of the other person. So it's really going beyond the strictly factual. So it's more than just gathering data. It's what she says, it's when we perceive reality, it's always something, there is always some interpretation going on, right? So it's not something that we can just take at face value. And she said that, like, if you try to imagine yourself and try to kind of read yourself into the situation of the other, imagine how that is for another person, you can try to, you get a clearer vision of what is really needed. Other strategies that she refers to is art. She says, like, well, when art is also a kind of imagination, you could say, but it gives us a kind of access to the world that we personally not always have. So you can become aware of how other people think and feel through art, for instance. And another way of unselfing, and so to get away from yourself and into the world, is through nature. Being in nature or seeing, smelling, hearing nature can also enable a kind of detachment, detachment from this self-concern, and provide us with a kind of unselfish attention. And it enables us to see things that we normally in everyday life ignore or are blind to. And she gives an example of that, which I would like to share with you. And she said, like, yeah, I'm looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, and brooding perhaps on some damage that has been done to my prestige. I'm self-concerned, and then I perceived this beautiful bird, this hovering kestrel, and then in that moment everything shifts. So it's not, I'm no longer thinking about me and my problems, but all my attention is going outside to that bird, and I vanish, so to say. So this brooding self vanishes, and there is nothing but this kestrel, this bird. And on that moment, I'm able to kind of get away from my self interest and my self-centeredness. And so you might think, like, well, this is all interesting, but what does this have to do with me building robots or me engaging in data analytics? So what is important to kind of, I think, take from this is that the way that we perceive the world around us, the way that we are perceiving our technologies is always, there's always an interpretation going on. And oftentimes without knowing, this is an interpretation that is based on this concern, this fat ego, so to say. And we can kind of try to escape that through these moral imaginations, to finding strategies to unself, so to say. But what is important, I think, and this is not something that Murdoch is pointing at, but I think it's important for us, is that technology is also a part of that mediation. Even, and this might sounds a bit superficial, or even in this example of Murdoch, she's looking through a window to that bird. So she's enabled through the technology of the window, which is of course a very, in our case, old-fashioned technology, you could say. She's enabled through that window to actually unself and focus on that bird that is passing and getting her out of her self-centered mode. So I think if you can kind of translate that to the data-driven practice, to see another person justly, or to see a need or a need of a user justly, we need to kind of be aware that we are not perceiving reality directly, but that we are oftentimes perceiving it through data, so that we kind of need to remain conscious about our self-centered perspective, but also about the fact how that the technology is also shaping the way that we perceive the other. And I think here is something that we could take from this virtue ethics approach and from Murdoch, that we kind of need to find strategies to do that, to kind of get away from our self-centered fat ego, and to find ways to deal with how the technology is mediating that perception. So if we take this kind of more theoretical concept and knowledge to our context of developing robotics, developing technologies, what does that mean? So I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that just knowing the proper values is not enough. We have to kind of be able to tailor them to the situation at hand, and in order to see this situation at hand in a clear way, to use Murdoch's thinking, we have to kind of find ways to unself and to think of these technological mediations. And I think that we can identify several challenges in our data-driven practice to engage in this unselfing. And one of them is a kind of societal perspective on what it means to be a data scientist, or to be an engineer, or to be machine learning expert. So I'm talking here in a general way of tech professionals, although I think it might be very interesting to kind of, you could also kind of really tailor it to specific expertise and specific roles. But generally you could say that being in the data-driven domain, being able to build these technologies is often perceived as being Davenport and Patil refer to it as the sexiest job of the 21st century. And this is kind of a societal perspective on what it means to be in charge of developing these technologies. And this, although you might think on a personal level, well, I'm not influenced by that, but I do believe that the context and the way in which we as a society, we think of these professions does also impact on how we see ourselves. And this perspective might actually kind of nurture this fat, relentless ego, so that we kind of be aware of the way in which that society is perceiving of these tech professionals. And of course, if you're building technologies, it makes sense that you are focusing on technologies and data and technological problems. But it also makes, and this is also what Murdoch is referring to, that you kind of automatically almost see problems as technical problems. Even if you're engaging, and hopefully we can discuss that later, even if you're engaging in community-driven design thinking, etc., or design strategies, there's always the implicit idea that the solution will be a designed solution, right? So you always already have this kind of implicit sorting of thinking. And so unselfing as a tech professional would mean that you kind of are so open to the problem at hand that you also could kind of be very humble and say like, well, maybe my tech solution isn't the proper solution. And that is a very difficult and hard thing, I think, to do. And again, also being aware of and giving account for this data-driven mediation, so that the way that we perceive of these problems is oftentimes through the data, and this is not the actual world, of course. So taking these challenges, then interestingly enough, Murdoch already mentions that humility probably is one of the most central virtues. And it makes sense in her perspective, because this self-centered tendency that we have is getting in the way of seeing what is really morally needed. So humility is a very important virtue to develop. And I think it's interesting if you go back to education and how we teach and think of technical professions. I don't think that humility necessarily is always in the center of these educational programs. So it would be interesting to kind of not just teach what you can do with data and with technologies, but also kind of very explicitly address where the limits are. And so I think this unselfing and can also be part of our education. Interestingly enough, Murdoch also says that, of course, you can turn to art and you can turn to nature, but actually in learning things, and I think this is really important for tech professionals, because you're always learning, you're always keeping an eye on the new developments. And when you're doing that, you always feel this uncertainty that you don't master yet all the details and the new knowledge. So in that moment, you feel the humility. You feel that you're still this relentless fat ego is a bit more on the background because you're not the expert yet. So this moment, this feeling, it can be a very important anchor point actually to learn how to see without, or to perceive problems without this self-centered ego. And that would also, if we could keep that kind of yeah, emotion, that kind of feeling actually could help us also in a more intellectual activities to keep being critical and aware of our data-driven mediated perception. And I believe that especially also for tech professionals, there is this interesting, you already have these technical skills of looking at, when you're defining the problem, looking at the context, looking at what persons need from their robots. But this is I would say currently still much focused on developing the best technical solution. So, but these moments you could also use to look at the moral aspects of the problem. So what is really ethically at stake for these end users? So there I also see an important anchoring point for engaging in unselfing and trying to get this just mode of vision and clear consciousness. And I also think engaging with art, and you see increasingly also there, I think, opportunities and art in a broad perspective. So I think also movies, books can help us there as well to kind of train ourselves in seeing what is ethically at stake and getting away from our fat, relentless ego and getting kind of more critical about our data-driven mediations of these ethical problems.